It all started so innocently, one of those ordinary summer nights when the air smelled sweet from the heat of the day. Our family gatherings were always full of laughter, stories, and the comforting buzz of familiar voices. But that evening? It wasn't like the others. I was standing on the terrace, watching the sky turn shades of pink and orange, thinking about nothing in particular. That's when I felt him behind me. My Uncle Alex. He was always around at family events, always the charmer with that easygoing confidence. But something about his presence tonight felt different. Off, in a way I couldn't quite explain. "You seem different tonight," he said softly, stepping just close enough that his voice felt like it was brushing against my skin. I froze for a moment. Different? Why would he say that? I turned toward him, trying to read his expression. His eyes were locked on mine, deep, intent, like he saw something I didn't even understand about myself yet. I didn't know how to respond, so I forced a smile and stepped back, pretending to be unfazed. But inside, my heart was racing. I knew I should walk away. I knew I should avoid whatever weird energy was building between us. But I didn't. I stayed there longer than I should have, pretending I wasn't affected by his words, his stare, the way he seemed to look at me just a little too long. That's when it started, the feeling I couldn't name, something strange stirring deep inside me. I didn't want to admit it, not even to myself. He was family, for God's sake. This wasn't supposed to happen, right? But the more I tried to push it away, the stronger it grew. Later that night, after dinner, everyone began retreating to their rooms, the house falling quiet one room at a time. I thought I could shake off whatever weird tension had been growing between us by getting some fresh air. So, I slipped outside onto the back porch, letting the cool night air wash over me. And that's when I saw him. Alex was already out there, leaning casually against the railing, as if he'd been waiting for something or someone. Our eyes met, and suddenly, everything felt heavier. The air between us, the silence, even the way he was standing. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to go back inside before something happened. But my feet wouldn't move. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked, his voice calm, almost amused. I shook my head, unable to form words. My heart was pounding so loudly in my chest, I was sure he could hear it. He didn't move closer, didn't try to break the silence that stretched between us like a live wire. Instead, he just stood there, waiting. For what, I didn't know. But something told me that tonight wasn't going to end like any other. No, this night was just the beginning. And trust me, it only gets crazier from here. I didn't expect to find him there. The moment I stepped onto the dimly lit patio and saw Alex standing under the old oak tree, my first instinct was to turn back and quietly slip inside. Pretend I hadn't seen him. Pretend he wasn't standing there, looking like he owned the night. But it was too late. He noticed me before I could even take a step back. "Late for a walk, don't you think?" he said, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. His voice was calm, steady, as if this was nothing unusual. But it wasn't nothing. I could feel it in the air, a tension I didn't understand, one that made my skin prickle and my heart race. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to keep my voice even. Just needed some fresh air. I clasped my hands behind my back, hoping he wouldn't notice how they trembled. He didn't move. He just stood there, watching me with that same unreadable expression he'd had earlier. It wasn't like before, when he was just my Uncle Alex, the cool, confident guy everyone in the family admired. No, this was different. The way he was looking at me now felt dangerous. We stood there in silence for what felt like forever. Every second stretched into eternity, each beat of my heart echoing in my ears. I tried to convince myself that this was just a normal evening, a normal conversation. But nothing about this felt normal. Not the way he was standing. Not the way he was looking at me. Not the way I couldn't seem to breathe properly. And then, out of nowhere, he spoke again. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "Have you ever been scared by your own thoughts?" he asked, tilting his head slightly, his eyes locked on mine. The question caught me off guard, sending a jolt through my chest. Scared? By my thoughts? What was he even talking about? Why would he ask me that? I hesitated, unsure how to respond. My mind scrambled for something, anything, that wouldn't make me sound as confused as I felt. Sometimes, I admitted quietly, keeping my gaze fixed somewhere off to the side, anywhere but on him. And you? He took a step closer. Not enough to close the distance entirely, but enough that I could feel the shift in the air between us. My breath hitched involuntarily. "Often," he said, his voice calm but laced with something I couldn't quite place. "Especially lately." His words hung in the air, heavy and unsettling. I didn't know what he meant, but something about the way he said it made my pulse quicken. What was he thinking? What was he trying to say? I glanced at him, and for the first time that night, I didn't see the uncle I thought I knew. Instead, I saw someone else entirely, someone whose presence made my heart race in ways it shouldn't. I wanted to say something, to break the silence before it swallowed me whole. But before I could, he spoke again, his voice quieter this time, almost hesitant. "Sometimes I wonder if it's just me," he said, his eyes flickering with something I couldn't quite read. "Or if other people feel it too." "Feel what?" I wanted to ask. But the words wouldn't come. All I could do was stand there, caught between wanting to run back inside and wanting to stay right where I was. This wasn't normal. This wasn't right. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself of that, I couldn't deny the pull I felt toward him, the curiosity, the confusion, the strange, unnameable feeling that had taken root inside me. And then he smiled again, that faint, almost teasing smile that made my stomach twist in ways I didn't understand. "You should get some sleep," he said finally, breaking the tension with a casualness that felt almost cruel. "Big day tomorrow, right?" I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Without another word, I turned and walked back inside, my heart pounding with every step. But even as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the quiet hum of the night outside, I couldn't stop thinking about him. About what he'd said. About the way he'd looked at me. Something had changed between us. I didn't know what it was, but I knew one thing for sure: this was just the beginning. And somehow, I had a feeling that whatever came next would be even more complicated. Even more dangerous. The next day, we barely spoke. Alex was always around, talking with the other relatives, laughing at jokes, helping out wherever he could, but every time I caught his gaze, a cold shiver ran down my spine. His eyes lingered just a second too long, as if he could see straight through me. Like he knew everything I had been thinking about the night before. I tried to act normal, but it wasn't easy. My heart wouldn't stop racing, and every stolen glance only made things worse. "You're awfully quiet today," my cousin Sarah said as we stood in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for lunch. "Everything okay?" I forced a smile, shaking my head to dismiss her concern. "Yeah, just tired." She raised an eyebrow, clearly not convinced, but didn't press further. I was grateful for that because I didn't have the energy to explain something I didn't even understand myself. Inside, a storm raged. I hadn't slept at all the previous night. Every moment replayed over and over in my mind, the way Alex had looked at me, the strange weight of his words, the unspoken tension that hung between us. I kept asking myself why he said what he did. Was he just teasing me? Or was it something more? Something I wasn't ready to admit? By the time evening rolled around, I was on edge. Everyone gathered around the fire pit outside, the warmth of the flames casting flickering shadows across the yard. The atmosphere was light, filled with laughter and chatter, but I couldn't relax. Not with him sitting across from me, his gaze burning into me from across the fire. I tried to ignore it. Tried to focus on the conversation around me. But every time I felt his eyes on me, my pulse quickened, my breath caught in my throat. It was like he had some kind of invisible hold over me, one I couldn't break no matter how hard I tried. After what felt like an eternity, I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up, muttering something about needing to cool off, and walked toward the house, desperate to put some distance between us. The air inside was cooler, quieter, and I let out a shaky breath, hoping it would calm the racing thoughts in my mind. But just as I started to feel a sliver of relief, I heard footsteps behind me. "You're running away," Alex said, his voice low but clear in the stillness of the hallway. I turned slowly to face him, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out every other sound. He stood just a few steps away, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable but intense. "No," I said, forcing myself to sound calm. "I just needed a moment to myself." He took a step closer, closing the gap between us slightly. The tension in the air was almost tangible, thick enough to cut with a knife. "You sure about that?" he asked, a hint of something, teasing, maybe, or something darker, creeping into his voice. I didn't know how to respond. My mind was racing, torn between 1,000 conflicting emotions. Part of me wanted to tell him to stop, to go back outside and leave me alone. But another part, a part one didn't want to acknowledge, wanted him to stay. He took another step closer, and suddenly, he was right in front of me. I could feel the heat radiating off him, see the way the dim light caught in his eyes, making them seem darker, more dangerous. "Maybe," he said softly, his voice barely more than a whisper, "we both know why you really left." His words hit me like a lightning bolt, stealing the breath from my lungs. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but no words came out. All I could do was stand there, frozen, as the weight of what he said settled over me. He was right. And we both knew it. I took a step back, my heart pounding so loudly in my chest that it drowned out every rational thought. Alex didn't stop. He moved closer, his presence filling the space between us until it felt like there was no air left to breathe. The warm night air was thick, carrying the faint scent of his cologne, subtle, familiar, dangerously intoxicating. I wanted to speak, to say something that would break whatever was happening between us, but the words caught in my throat. "Alex," I whispered, barely able to get his name out. My voice was unsteady, betraying the storm raging inside me. "We shouldn't." "Don't," he interrupted, his eyes locked on mine, steady, unyielding. "I know it's wrong. But you feel it too, don't you?" His words hit me like a jolt of electricity, sending a shockwave through my entire body. I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was imagining things. But the truth was, I couldn't. Every fiber of my being reacted to him in a way that I couldn't control, couldn't ignore. I knew we shouldn't be here, like this. I knew we shouldn't even be thinking about this. But knowing it was wrong didn't stop the way my heart raced whenever he was near, didn't stop the pull I felt toward him, like gravity drawing me closer despite every instinct screaming at me to run. "We can't," I said weakly, my voice trembling as much as my hands. "This isn't." "But you want it," he said softly, his voice low and steady, cutting through the silence like a knife. He leaned in just a little, so close that I could feel the warmth of his breath against my skin. "You can't tell me you don't." I opened my mouth to protest, to say something, anything, that would put an end to this madness. But before I could, he closed the distance between us completely. His lips brushed mine, tentative at first, as if waiting for me to pull away. I didn't. The moment his lips touched mine, it was like something inside me snapped. All the tension, all the confusion, all the forbidden thoughts I had been trying to suppress came rushing to the surface, overwhelming me completely. He kissed me again, deeper this time, and I found myself leaning into him, my body responding before my mind could catch up. Every rational thought dissolved, leaving only the intensity of the moment, the heat, the closeness, the undeniable pull between us. I knew it was wrong. I knew we were crossing a line we could never uncross. But I couldn't bring myself to stop. His hands found my waist, pulling me closer, and I didn't resist. My fingers tangled in his shirt, gripping it tightly as if holding on to him could somehow steady the whirlwind of emotions inside me. The world around us seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of us, caught in a moment that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. When he finally pulled back, his eyes searched mine, as if looking for any sign of regret. I was breathing hard, my heart racing, my mind a blur of emotions I couldn't begin to untangle. "This changes everything," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of my own heartbeat. "I know," he said, his voice steady, but there was something vulnerable in his eyes. "But I don't care." I should have cared. I should have been thinking about the consequences, about what would happen if anyone found out. But in that moment, all I could think about was him, about the way he made me feel, about the way I didn't want this to end. We stood there in silence for a long moment, the weight of what had just happened hanging heavily in the air between us. I knew I should walk away, that I should put as much distance between us as possible before we did something we couldn't take back. But I didn't move. Neither did he. Instead, he reached for my hand, his touch gentle, hesitant, as if afraid I might pull away. I didn't. I couldn't. "This doesn't have to mean anything," he said quietly, his eyes searching mine for some kind of reassurance. "We don't have to make it complicated. It can just be this." I knew what he meant. He was offering me an out, a way to keep this from becoming something bigger, something messier. But even as he said it, I knew it wasn't that simple. "It's already complicated," I said softly, pulling my hand back reluctantly. "We can't pretend it isn't." He sighed, running a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. I don't know how to stop this. How to stop feeling like this." Neither did I. And that terrified me more than anything. "I need to go," I said finally, forcing myself to take a step back, then another. We can't do this." He didn't stop me. He just stood there, watching as I turned and walked away, my heart pounding harder with every step. But even as I put distance between us, I knew it wouldn't be enough. Because something had changed between us, something we couldn't take back, no matter how much we might want to. The next morning, I woke up feeling like my entire world had tilted on its axis. Guilt weighed heavily on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as the events of the previous night replayed in my mind on an endless loop. I couldn't believe it had happened. That we had happened. How did I let it get this far? I knew what we'd done was wrong, morally, ethically, in every possible way. And yet, no matter how hard I tried to drown the memories, the feel of his lips on mine, the way his hands gripped my waist, and the intensity of his gaze kept surfacing, dragging me deeper into a whirlpool of emotions. When I finally forced myself out of bed and went downstairs, Alex was already there, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee in hand, chatting casually with the others. He looked so normal. So composed. As if nothing had happened, as if we hadn't crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Our eyes met briefly across the room, and for a split second, I saw it, the flicker of something darker, something only we knew. My heart slammed against my ribcage, and I quickly looked away, my cheeks burning. All morning, I tried to keep my distance, but it was impossible to avoid him completely. Every time I passed him in the hall or caught a glimpse of him from across the room, my pulse quickened, and memories I didn't want to relive came rushing back. Finally, after lunch, we found ourselves alone in the living room. Everyone else had gone out for a walk, leaving the house eerily quiet. I was standing by the window, pretending to admire the view, when I heard his footsteps behind me. "You've been avoiding me," he said softly, his voice carrying that familiar calm confidence that both infuriated and unsettled me. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. "I'm not avoiding you," I said, though we both knew it was a lie. He stepped closer, so close that I could feel the heat radiating from his body. "You know this isn't over," he murmured, his voice low, almost a whisper. "What happened last night, that was only the beginning." I turned then, finally meeting his gaze. Alex, we can't, we shouldn't. My voice faltered, the words sounding weak even to me. But you don't regret it, he said, his eyes locked on mine, daring me to deny it. I opened my mouth to say that I did, that I regretted everything, but the words wouldn't come. Because deep down, I didn't. That was the most terrifying part of all, I didn't regret it. Despite the guilt, the fear, and the knowledge that this could ruin everything, a part of me wanted it to happen again. I don't know what to do, I admitted quietly, my voice barely audible. You don't have to know, he said, stepping even closer until there was barely any space left between us. You just have to feel. I closed my eyes, willing myself to find some semblance of control. But when I opened them, he was still there, so close, so steady, and I realized that I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't walk away from. The days that followed were a blur of tension and confusion. I tried to act normal, to pretend that nothing had changed. But everything had changed. I avoided being alone with Alex as much as possible, but it didn't matter. Every glance, every accidental brush of his hand, every moment we spent in the same room was charged with an unspoken tension that made my heart race and my mind spin. I thought I could handle it. I thought if I just kept my distance, if I stayed quiet, it would all eventually fade away. But I was wrong. The more I tried to resist, the stronger the pull became. And then, one evening, everything came crashing down. I had gone downstairs to get some water when I heard voices coming from the living room. I stopped in the hallway, my heart pounding as I recognized my mother's voice. She was talking on the phone, her tone low and serious. I don't know, she was saying, her voice filled with worry. Something's been off with her lately. She's been acting strange. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Was she talking about me? There was a long pause as she listened to whoever was on the other end of the line. Then, in a quieter voice, she said, I'm worried. I think she might be hiding something. Panic surged through me, and for a moment, I couldn't move. Did she know? Had she noticed something between me and Alex? Before I could gather my thoughts, she ended the call and turned around. Her eyes met mine, and in that instant, I knew she suspected something. We need to talk, she said quietly, her expression serious. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear her. About what? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stepped closer, her eyes searching mine, as if trying to read my mind. Is there something you want to tell me? She asked softly. I shook my head, too afraid to speak. Are you sure? She pressed, her voice gentle but insistent. Because if there's something going on, I want to help. You don't have to go through it alone. For a moment, I considered telling her everything about Alex, about the confusion, the guilt, the feelings I didn't know how to handle. But the words wouldn't come. I couldn't bring myself to say it. I'm fine, I said finally, forcing a smile. Really, I'm fine. She didn't look convinced, but she didn't push further. Okay, she said quietly. But if you ever need to talk, you know where to find me. I nodded, my heart still racing as she turned and walked away. As soon as she was gone, I leaned against the wall, trying to calm the storm inside me. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was spiraling out of control. I knew in that moment that this was far from over. My mother suspected something, and if I wasn't careful, the secret I was so desperately trying to hide would come crashing down around me. But more than that, I realized something else. No matter how wrong it was, no matter how much I tried to fight it, I didn't want to let Alex go.